Hi, I'm Mikey. Welcome to my sewing room. Let's talk about some sewing concepts today and assumed knowledge within sewing patterns. As a beginner, some of the things that you might see in a sewing pattern might be difficult to understand because they're not clearly explained in the sewing pattern. One of those things is something called understitching. Quite often, understitching is called for example, on a neck facing or on a pocket, but it doesn't tell you why and it doesn't tell you how to do it. Let's break it down, look at the steps involved, look at what it looks like, and how and where we can use it. Here you can see two examples of a bodice front with a neckline facing. One of them has been understitched, and one of them hasn't. You can see on the one with the understitching, there's a row of stitches very close to the edge where the facing is folded to the wrong side. If we flip to the right side, there are no stitches visible here, and if I lay it flat on the table, the facing is completely hidden and nothing shows through. If we take a look at the example with no understitching, you can see that it's not nearly as neat. There are creases in the facing where the fabric is a little stretched. As we move to where the shoulder seam would be, you can see that the fold is much deeper, meaning the shape's not quite right. Without any understitching, this can happen over time when wearing and washing a garment repeatedly. Laying this example flat on the table reveals something very different. The facing fabric is showing through, peeking over the top of the neckline, and the garment fabric shows signs of creasing and tightness where it's been folded in the opposite direction to the curve. Another thing we can look at is how it would appear when it's being worn. If I take my tailor's ham and I lay the fabric over the curve, you can see in the example with no understitching that the facing fabric becomes even more obvious. If we repeat this with the understitched example, even at this curve the facing isn't visible unless you look directly down from the top. There's no stitching visible on the outside and it gives a very clean, neat finish to the neckline. If your garment has a neckline facing like this and the pattern tells you to top stitch, you could substitute this for an understitch if you prefer the look. Let's take some new sample pieces and have a look at how understitching's done. Here I have a bodice front with a facing ready to be attached. You can see I've pinned all the way around, so now I'll take this over to the sewing machine and stitch at the seam allowance specified in my pattern. At this stage, I'm not doing anything special, I'm using my regular stitch length and I'll backstitch at the beginning and at the end. If I put this clip in real time, you can see that I'm going very slowly around this curve. I need to adjust the fabric as I go to keep my stitches and my seam allowance nice and even. Once that's stitched in place, this is what I have so far. And you can see all I've done up to this stage is one long continuous stitch from one end to the other. I'll trim off my loose threads and then I'll get the piece ready to understitch. Next, I'll trim down the seam allowance all the way around the neckline. I need to trim to somewhere between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch all the way around. I'll just do this using my regular fabric scissors, and it doesn't need to be perfect as this won't be seen from the outside of the garment. Because this is a curved area, I'm going to clip into the seam allowance. Clipping in just means making some cuts into the seam allowance. I'll cut as close to the stitches as possible without cutting through them, and the steeper the curve, the closer together the cuts. On the very curved areas, I'm clipping in around every 1/2 inch. On the less curved areas, somewhere between 1 inch to 1.5 inches. As you can see, the point of my scissors is almost touching the stitches, but not quite. If you do snip through the stitches, it's not the end of the world, it just means that you'll need to stitch them again. Now I'll flip the facing up, making sure the seam allowance is underneath. I'll stitch a line very close to the original stitching line, but only through the facing and the seam allowance. With the seam allowance face down and the facing on top of it, I'll position the fabric underneath the presser foot. Then I'll drop the needle and have a quick check just to make sure everything's in the right place. can see that the seam allowance is underneath the facing, so I'll begin with the back stitch. I'm taking a very small seam allowance here and using my regular stitch length. Just as before, because we're dealing with a curve, I'm going to sew nice and slowly all the way around, and I'll constantly adjust the fabric as I go. You'll see that both the main fabric and the facing fabric will want to bunch up. Don't worry, it's absolutely fine. As long as none of the wrinkles or puckers make it under your needle, they won't be seen in the finished garment. Here's another example of the fabric wanting to crease. It's absolutely fine, and I can straighten it out before it goes under the needle. I'm making lots of adjustments as I sew all the way around, and I'm constantly checking either by looking or by feeling that the seam allowance is underneath the facing. Here's what it looks like after understitching. So the facing is now secured to the seam allowance, and if we look closely you can see that the stitching is within about 1/8 of an inch. One of the best things about using understitching on a neck facing like this is that even without pressing, you can see that the neck facing wants to sit flat and it wants to sit behind the main fabric. So if I flip it over, you can see already that facing isn't visible from the front of the garment. I'm of course going to press it because that's going to help relax the threads and relax all the fibres in the fabric. And also, what kind of sewing content would this be without an overhead ironing shot? And you can see it looks beautiful. Nothing visible from the front of the fabric, and if we flip it over, the facing sits nice and flat against the back. Hopefully that gives you a little bit more of an understanding of what understitching is and where it can be used. Remember, just because something's not in a sewing pattern doesn't mean that you can't use it. If you're sewing something and you think that it could benefit from an understitch, absolutely put it in there. The same applies for a basting stitch or for a stay stitch, which we'll cover in another video. Thank you so much for joining me. If you found this video useful, please let me know down in the comments below. You can also give the video a thumbs up. Here is what YouTube thinks that you may enjoy watching next. And here is where you can subscribe to my channel for more content like this. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, happy sewing, and hopefully I'll see you again soon.